The muted afternoon light filtered through the sheer curtains, casting long shadows across Baiwei's apartment. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams, a silent ballet against the backdrop of her packing. 3 years. 3 years condensed into neatly folded sweaters, stacked books, and a life she was meticulously dismantling. Each item she touched resonated with a memory, a whispered echo of laughter, a shared glance, a touch. She paused, fingers hovering over a framed photograph of her and Yunshin, their smiles bright against the backdrop of a vibrant sunset. A bitter taste bloomed in her mouth, a familiar ache tightening around her heart. The sunset had been beautiful, yes, but it had cast long shadows even then, the silhouette of Meng Qingli looming large between them. Baiwei's mother sat on the edge of the bed, watching her daughter with a quiet sadness in her eyes. "Are you sure about this, Baiwei?" Her voice was soft, hesitant, laced with the unspoken question of whether this decision was truly thought through, or born of a fleeting moment of pain. "Yes, Mom." Baiwei's voice was steady, betraying none of the turmoil churning within. "Gu Yun and I have been in love for 3 years." The words felt hollow, a recitation of a script she no longer believed. "Today, I decided to leave him." The finality of the statement hung heavy in the air, a guillotine severing the fragile threads of their shared history. Her mother's gaze sharpened, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. She had seen the subtle shifts in Baiwei's demeanor, the forced smiles, the fleeting moments of withdrawal. "It wasn't a whim, was it?" Baiwei shook her head, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. She swiped it away impatiently. From beginning to end, he was just a stand-in for Meng Qinlin. The admission tasted like ash in her mouth, a painful truth she had avoided confronting for far too long. "I saw it, Mom." In his eyes, in his hesitant touches, in the way he'd sometimes go quiet, lost in thoughts I could never access. A choked laugh escaped her. "I don't want to be another tool, a placeholder in someone else's story." Her mother reached out, her hand warm and comforting on Baiwei's arm. "You deserve more than that, Baiwei. You deserve someone who sees you, who chooses you, wholeheartedly." Baiwei nodded, the tightness in her chest easing slightly. Her mother's words were a balm to the raw wounds of her pride. Yet, a lingering sadness persisted. She had loved him, foolishly, blindly, filling the gaps in his heart with her own affection, hoping that one day, it would be enough. It never was. The following days were a blur of packing, farewells, and the dull ache of finality. She saw Menghe, her childhood friend, a silent confidant who understood the unspoken nuances of her relationship with Yunshin. They sat in their usual corner booth at their favorite cafe, the aroma of coffee and pastries a familiar comfort in the face of the unknown. "You're doing the right thing, Baiwei," Menghe said, his voice gentle but firm. "He would have kept you dangling, caught in the ghost of his past." He reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "Don't let him steal any more of your future." His words resonated deeply. Baiwei knew he was right. Staying would have been a slow, agonizing death of her spirit, a life lived in the shadow of another woman. She deserved more, a love that was whole, untainted by the remnants of a past she could never compete with. The realization brought a strange sense of peace, a quiet strength that replaced the gnawing uncertainty. The day of her departure dawned crisp and clear, the sky a vast expanse of blue, promising new beginnings. Standing at the airport gate, Baiwei felt a pang of sadness, a fleeting moment of regret. But it was quickly overshadowed by a surge of anticipation. This was not an ending, but a beginning, a chance to rewrite her story, to create a future filled with possibilities. She took a deep breath, the crisp air filling her lungs, and stepped onto the plane, leaving behind the ghosts of yesterday and embracing the promise of tomorrow. She had loved, she had lost, and now, she was finally free. The image of Yunshin's face, etched with confusion and a flicker of something that might have been regret, faded into the background, replaced by the vast, open horizon stretching before her. The future was a blank canvas, and she was ready to paint it with the vibrant colors of her own choosing. The world, she realized with a newfound sense of wonder, was once again hers for the taking. The past, like the city shrinking beneath her, was finally receding into the distance. The aroma of ginger and garlic, a familiar comfort in their small apartment, hung heavy in the air. Baiwei carefully arranged the braised fish, its glistening skin reflecting the muted afternoon light, on a plate beside the stir-fried vegetables. She'd taken extra care, meticulously chopping the spring onions into perfect slivers, a habit born from the quiet satisfaction of creating something beautiful, even in the face of an ending. He wouldn't notice, of course. He rarely did. But she did it anyway, a small act of defiance against the hollowness that had settled in her chest. "Yun Shen, have you washed it yet? Come on, the food is getting cold." Her voice was even, betraying none of the tremor of anxiety that ran through her. Each word felt like a small stone dropped into the vast, silent well of their apartment, echoing with the unspoken. He was hunched over his laptop at the small dining table, the blue light of the screen illuminating his face, casting long shadows that emphasized the lines of weariness etched around his eyes. He hadn't even glanced up. "The company has something to do." His reply was clipped, his attention still fixed on the screen. A familiar pang of disappointment, now dull and aching from repetition, resonated within her. 3 years. 3 years of carefully constructed meals, of trying to bridge the chasm that always seemed to exist between them. 3 years of chasing a ghost. "Eat by yourself." The words tumbled out, heavier than she intended. She sat down at the table, picking up her chopsticks with a hand that trembled slightly. The scent of the food, once comforting, now felt cloying, a bitter reminder of all the meals they'd shared, not in companionship, but in a strange, silent coexistence. She forced herself to take a bite, the taste bland on her tongue. He didn't acknowledge her words, the rhythmic tapping of his keyboard filling the silence. The click-clack was a relentless soundtrack to their disintegrating relationship. Outside, the city hummed with life, a stark contrast to the suffocating stillness within their walls. Baiwei stared at the swirling patterns in the wooden table, her mind a whirlwind of unshed tears and unspoken resentments. Had she ever truly known him? Or had she merely constructed a version of him in her mind, a man who existed only in the hopeful spaces of her own desires? "For all these years, I never asked you why you chose to be with me in the first place." The thought hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. She knew the answer, though she had avoided confronting it for far too long. It was etched in the way he sometimes looked at her, a fleeting expression of longing that wasn't meant for her, in the way his hand would hesitate before reaching for hers. He was with her, but he wasn't present. He was a living ghost, haunted by a past she could never hope to erase. Meng Qingli. The name, unuttered, echoed in the silence between them. The fish grew cold on the plate, its once vibrant colors fading into a dull, lifeless gray. Just like their relationship, she thought, a flicker of bitter amusement twisting her lips. She pushed the plate away, the clatter of chopsticks against ceramic a sharp intrusion in the quiet apartment. He finally looked up, his brow furrowed in annoyance. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice flat, devoid of genuine concern. Baiwei met his gaze, a sudden surge of weariness washing over her. There was no point. No point in explanations, in recriminations, in dredging up the ghosts that haunted them both. It was over. The realization, though painful, brought a strange sense of peace. "Nothing," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. "I just lost my appetite." He simply nodded, his gaze returning to the screen. The blue light reflected in his eyes, cold and distant. Baiwei watched him, a strange detachment settling over her. This was it. The final scene of a play performed for an audience of one. She'd played her part, clinging to the hope of a happy ending that never materialized. Now, the curtain was falling. She stood up, the chair scraping against the wooden floor, the sound echoing in the sudden stillness. He didn't react. He didn't even look up. Bai Wei gathered her bag, the familiar weight of it grounding her in the present. She paused at the doorway, a fleeting urge to say something, anything, to break the silence that stretched between them like a chasm. But the words wouldn't come. There was nothing left to say. Turning away, she walked out of the apartment, leaving behind the scent of ginger and garlic, the cold, uneaten fish, and the ghost of a love that had never truly been hers. Su Menghe was waiting downstairs, leaning against her car, a knowing sadness in her eyes. Bai Wei managed a weak smile. "Let's go," she said, her voice hoarse. As Menghe started the car, pulling away from the curb, Bai Wei looked back at the apartment building, a single light flickering in the window. A wave of sadness washed over her, quickly followed by a surge of resolve. It was over. And she was finally free. The harsh fluorescent lights of the airport reflected in the polished floors, creating a sterile sheen that mirrored the hollowness in Zhou Baiwei's chest. The digital clock flashed 7:58. 2 minutes. Her hand tightened around the worn leather strap of her carry-on. He wouldn't come. She knew it with a chilling certainty that settled deep in her bones, a certainty that had been slowly solidifying over the past few months, hardening like a sculptor's clay left out in the unforgiving sun. "If I don't see you when I get to the airport at 8 o'clock, you're screwed," she had told him, her voice laced with a forced lightness that had betrayed the tremor in her heart. It was a bluff, a desperate attempt to elicit a reaction, a flicker of genuine emotion from the man who had become an enigma wrapped in a tailored suit. But even bluffs needed an audience, and Gu Yunshan had chosen not to attend. The loudspeaker crackled to life, announcing a delayed flight to London. The robotic voice droned on, a background hum to the internal cacophony in Bai Wei's mind. Each announcement was a nail hammered into the coffin of their 3-year relationship. 3 years of stolen glances, hushed conversations, and a love that had blossomed in the shadow of another. 3 years spent watering a garden that would never bloom, nurturing a seed that had already withered. Su Menghe squeezed her hand, a silent offering of comfort. Menghe, her childhood friend, the silent witness to her slow descent into the labyrinth of unrequited affection. He knew. He had always known. His presence was a steady anchor in the tumultuous sea of her emotions. She managed a weak smile, a fragile construct meant to reassure him more than herself. "He's not coming," Menghe stated, his voice low and gentle, a stark contrast to the impersonal airport announcements. It wasn't a question, it was an acknowledgement of the shared truth that hung heavy in the air. Bai Wei swallowed, the lump in her throat constricting her airway. "I know," she whispered, the words barely audible above the rumbling of luggage carts and the hurried footsteps of travelers. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. She didn't just know he wasn't coming, she had anticipated it, braced herself for the final blow. Yet, a sliver of hope, irrational and persistent, had clung to the edges of her consciousness until this very moment. A flashback, sharp and vivid, pierced through the fog of her present despair. A dimly lit café, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee hanging in the air. "Gu Yunsheng, I like you," a younger, more naive Bai Wei had confessed, her voice trembling with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. His response had been a hesitant smile, a fleeting touch of his hand on hers, and a silence that spoke volumes. Even then, the ghost of Meng Qingli had lingered between them, an invisible barrier she couldn't breach. She had known about Meng Qingli from the start. The childhood sweetheart, the first love, the unattainable ideal. Yunshan had never spoken of her directly, but her presence permeated his silences, the wistful look in his eyes when he stared into the distance, the way his hand would unconsciously reach for his phone as if expecting a call that would never come. Bai Wei had foolishly believed she could fill the void, that her love, her devotion, could erase the imprint Meng Qingli had left on his soul. She had been wrong. Another flashback. Yunshen's apartment, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. His fingers tracing the outline of a faded photograph, a picture of a young woman with laughing eyes and a mischievous smile. Meng Qingli. Bai Wei had seen the photograph by accident, a glimpse into a past he kept carefully locked away. In that moment, the fragile illusion she had built around herself shattered, the pieces scattering like broken glass. She had finally understood. She was a substitute, a placeholder, a temporary distraction from the ache in his heart. 8 o'clock, the final boarding call for her flight echoed through the terminal. The knot in her stomach tightened, a physical manifestation of the emotional turmoil raging within her. "Thanks, but I'm sorry," she murmured to Meng He, the words laced with a complex mix of gratitude and regret. Gratitude for his unwavering friendship, his silent understanding, his presence in her life. Regret for the time wasted, the emotions invested in a love that was destined to fail. Turning away, she walked towards the gate, her steps firm and resolute despite the tremor in her legs. With each step, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders, the burden of unrequited love slowly dissipating into the sterile airport air. She didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. The chapter was closed. The hum of the airplane engine was a lullaby, a soothing balm to her frayed nerves. As the plane ascended, leaving the city lights behind, she closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but a tear of liberation. The pain would linger, a dull ache in her chest, a reminder of a love that never truly was. But the future stretched before her, a blank canvas waiting to be painted with new experiences, new relationships, a new life free from the ghost of Meng Qingli. She was finally free. The countdown calendar sat on her bedside table, a stark white obelisk mocking the slow, agonizing death of their 3-year relationship. 365 days, meticulously marked, each one a testament to a love she now realized had never truly belonged to her. He'd given it to her on their anniversary, a gesture meant to symbolize their future together. Now, it felt like a countdown to her own oblivion. Bai Wei traced the outline of the current date with a trembling finger. How could he be so oblivious? So cruel? Or perhaps, she thought with a bitter twist in her gut, he wasn't oblivious at all. Perhaps this was his way of subtly pushing her away, of making her the one to finally sever the tie that he was too cowardly to cut himself. She'd known, hadn't she? Deep down, beneath the layers of carefully constructed hope, a nagging voice had always whispered doubts. The way his eyes would glaze over sometimes, lost in a thought she could never quite reach. The way he'd flinch at the mention of certain places, certain songs. Memories that didn't belong to them. Memories that belonged to Meng Qingli. Later that day, the air in the cafe crackled with unspoken tension. Su Menghe, ever the perceptive observer, stirred his coffee, his gaze shifting between Bai Wei and the cityscape sprawling outside the window. "You're quieter than usual, Bai Wei," he remarked, his voice soft, a gentle probe into the turbulent waters of her emotions. Bai Wei forced a smile, a brittle, fragile thing. "Just thinking. Thinking about how much of her life she'd invested in a man who was still living in the past. Thinking about the subtle, almost imperceptible ways Yunshen had kept her at arm's length, his heart a locked room she'd never been given the key to. About the calendar?" Menghe's question was a soft blow, a confirmation of what they both already knew. She nodded, the simple movement a heavy weight against her will. "It's insensitive, don't you think?" The question hung in the air, thick with unspoken accusations. Menghe sighed, the sound heavy with empathy. "He's not thinking clearly, Bai Wei. He never has been when it comes to," he trailed off, the unspoken name of Meng Qingli hanging between them like a phantom. To her, Bai Wei finished, the name a bitter taste on her tongue. It's always her, isn't it? The raw, ragged edge of her voice startled even herself. Another friend, Lin Wei, joined them, her cheerful greeting jarring against the somber atmosphere. "What's this about her?" she asked, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension. Bai Wei hesitated, the words catching in her throat. How could she explain the intricate web of emotions, the years of subtle hurts and unanswered questions? How could she explain the hollowness that gnawed at her insides, the realization that she'd been living a lie? Gu Yunshan's top WeChat contact is still Meng Qingli, Su Minghe said quietly, his gaze steady on Bai Wei. Lin Wei gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Seriously? After all this time? 3 years, Bai Wei confirmed, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. 3 years of dinners, birthdays, holidays, all overshadowed by the ghost of a woman who held captive the heart she so desperately craved. "He's an idiot," Lin Wei declared, her voice laced with indignation. "You deserve better, Bai Wei." Later that week, another confrontation unfolded, this time in the sterile environment of a hospital waiting room. Yunshan sat beside her, his hand resting on hers, a gesture that felt more like a possession than a comfort. "Why did you buy the countdown calendar?" The question slipped out, raw and accusatory. He flinched, his gaze flickering away from hers. "Chu thought it would be romantic," he stammered, the words lacking conviction. Bai Wei stared at him, the fluorescent lights of the waiting room casting harsh shadows on his face, highlighting the lines of indecision etched around his mouth. Romantic? Or a subconscious reminder of the time he'd lost, the time he wished he could have back with someone else? Romantic, she repeated, the word laced with disbelief. Or a reminder of everything we're not? He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, the words trapped somewhere between his heart and his mind. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken truths. "How much does Gu Yunshan love Meng Qingli?" Bai Wei finally asked, her voice a hollow whisper. He didn't answer, the silence a deafening confirmation. She didn't need words. She saw the answer in the flicker of pain in his eyes, in the tightness of his jaw, in the way his hand tightened around hers, as if trying to hold on to something that was already lost. "I have no idea," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "But I know, better than anyone. He doesn't love me." The words, once spoken, hung in the air, heavy with finality. The following days were a blur of packing, phone calls, and tearful goodbyes. Her friends rallied around her, a fortress of support against the storm raging within her. Lin Wei offered fierce protectiveness, while Su Minghe's quiet presence was a balm to her wounded spirit. There were moments, fleeting and fragile, when she felt a flicker of something more than friendship in his eyes. But she wasn't ready. She wasn't sure she would ever be ready again. As she stood on the doorstep of her new apartment, the key clutched tightly in her hand, she felt a sense of liberation mingled with a lingering ache. The countdown calendar was gone, discarded along with the fragments of a love that had never truly been hers. The future stretched before her, a blank canvas waiting to be filled with new colors, new experiences, new possibilities. She took a deep breath, the crisp autumn air filling her lungs, and stepped inside, ready to begin again. Leaving behind the ghost of Meng Qingli, and the man who couldn't let her go. The aroma of dark roasted coffee beans hung heavy in the Parisian air, a stark contrast to the bitter taste rising in Zhou Baiwei's mouth. She hadn't expected to see him here, not after meticulously planning her escape, her quiet retreat into a city brimming with strangers. Yet, there he was, Gu Yunshan, sitting across from her, a ghost materialized from the life she was so desperately trying to leave behind. His presence was a tangible weight, pressing down on her chest, stealing the very air she breathed. He looked tired. The sharp angles of his jaw seemed more pronounced, the shadows under his eyes deeper. A flicker of something akin to regret, or perhaps just confusion, danced in his gaze. Had she imagined the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for his cup? No, Bai Wei told herself, she wasn't here to dissect his emotions, not anymore. She had dissected them for 3 years, painstakingly piecing together the puzzle of his heart only to find a picture of someone else. He cleared his throat, the sound a brittle snap in the quiet hum of the cafe. Bai Wei, he began, his voice low, a rough caress against the delicate porcelain of her resolve. Why? The single word hung between them, heavy with unspoken accusations, with the bewilderment of a man who couldn't comprehend why the world wasn't bending to his will. Bai Wei watched the steam curl from her untouched espresso, the swirling patterns mirroring the chaotic thoughts in her head. Why? Because she was tired of being the echo of another woman's laughter, the shadow of another woman's love. Because she was tired of building a home in a heart already occupied. Why, Yunshen? She finally echoed, her voice surprisingly steady. Shouldn't you know the answer to that? A bitter smile touched her lips. She had hoped this conversation wouldn't be necessary, that he would understand the silent language of her absence. But some things, some pains, needed to be articulated, laid bare under the unforgiving Parisian light. He flinched, his gaze dropping to the table as if the polished wood held the answers he couldn't find in her eyes. Bai Wei knew he was thinking of Meng Qingli, the phantom limb of his past, the woman who still held his heart captive. The realization, once a sharp stab of pain, now felt like a dull ache, a familiar companion. Is it because of her? He asked, the name unspoken but hanging heavy in the air between them. Bai Wei took a slow, deliberate breath, the scent of coffee momentarily grounding her. She was in my dream, Yunshen, she began, her voice soft, almost a whisper, yet each word resonated with the weight of her decision. The dream, a recurring nightmare of Qingli's radiant smile and Yunshen's adoring gaze, had been the final push, the confirmation of what her heart already knew. It's just that I used to think that as long as I tried, you will like me one day. Her voice cracked slightly, a hairline fracture in her carefully constructed composure. She paused, gathering the remnants of her strength, her gaze locking with his. But after showing up in the dream, I just realized love cannot be achieved through hard work. A muscle twitched in his jaw, the only outward sign of the turmoil she knew must be raging within him. He opened his mouth to speak, but she held up a hand, silencing him. I'm tired, Yunshen, she continued, the words tumbling out, each syllable a small act of liberation. So I decided to break up. Her voice was firm now, the tremor gone, replaced by a quiet resolve. It's all the best. A small, sad smile played on her lips. It's better to take a chance to confess your love to Meng Qingli. She knew it was a gamble, a desperate attempt to jolt him awake, to force him to confront the ghost that haunted their relationship. He stared at her, his eyes wide, filled with a mixture of disbelief and something that looked suspiciously like panic. Bai Wei wondered if he'd ever truly considered the possibility of losing her, if he'd been so blinded by his past that he hadn't seen the slow erosion of their present. The cafe was dim, smelling faintly of burnt sugar and something vaguely floral. Gu Yunshen stirred his coffee, the small clinking sound echoing the emptiness in his chest. He hadn't realized how much of his life had revolved around Bai Wei, around the quiet comfort of her presence, until she was gone. He'd grown accustomed to the rhythm of their days, the way she'd raise an eyebrow at his dry humor, the way her hand would fit so perfectly in his. Now, the silence was deafening. Across from him, Meng Qingli spoke, her voice soft and concerned, but the words seemed to float past him, unabsorbed. He saw her lips move, her brow furrow, but the meaning remained elusive, trapped behind a wall of his own making. Was this guilt? Regret? He wasn't sure. He knew only a hollowness, a sense of something vital having been irrevocably lost. Meng Qingli reached across the table, her hand covering his. He flinched, the contact sending a jolt through him, not of comfort, but of unease. He saw a flicker of hurt in her eyes, quickly masked by a gentle smile. He pulled his hand away, murmuring an apology. He needed to leave, to breathe, to escape the suffocating weight of the unspoken. Later, Su Menghe found him at their usual bar, nursing a whiskey. "She's hurting, you know," Menghe said, his voice low, his gaze steady. Yunshin swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice clicking softly. He knew. He knew Bai Wei was hurting, but he didn't know how to fix it, how to fix himself. "I didn't mean," he started, the words trailing off, swallowed by the lump in his throat. What hadn't he meant? To hurt her. To lead her on. To make her believe in something that wasn't fully there. He closed his eyes, the image of Bai Wei's face, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, burned into his memory. Menghe sighed, the sound heavy with understanding. Sometimes, Yunshin, not meaning to isn't enough. Bai Wei walked along the bustling city streets, the noise and movement a stark contrast to the quiet turmoil within her. Each shop window, each passing face, seemed to reflect her own fractured self back at her. She'd been so sure, so confident in their love, only to discover she was living a shadow play, a stand-in for a ghost of Yunshin's past. The realization was a sharp, twisting pain, a constant ache beneath her ribs. Yet, amidst the pain, a new resolve began to solidify. She wouldn't let this break her. She wouldn't let his inability to let go define her future. As she rounded a corner, she bumped into a young woman, spilling the contents of her bag. "Oh, I'm so sorry," the woman exclaimed, her voice bright and apologetic. They both knelt to gather the scattered items, their hands brushing. The woman smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. "It's all right," Bai Wei managed, surprised by the calmness in her own voice. They chatted as they repacked her bag, a simple conversation about the weather, about the best coffee shops in the area. Yet, in that brief exchange, a tiny spark ignited within Bai Wei, a flicker of hope in the vast darkness. Months blurred into a year. The sharp edges of the breakup softened, the raw pain dulled into a quiet ache. Bai Wei focused on her work, on rebuilding her life, brick by brick. She found solace in small things, in the warmth of the morning sun, in the laughter of friends, in the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. She even started painting again, filling canvases with vibrant colors, with the emotions she could finally begin to express. One rainy afternoon, Bai Wei found herself at the hospital, visiting a friend. As she waited in the lobby, she saw him. Gu Yunshin. He was pacing nervously, his face etched with worry, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. He looked different. Older, somehow. The carefree air he'd once carried was gone, replaced by a deep-seated anxiety. Then she heard his voice, strained and desperate, speaking into the phone. "Please, just tell me she's okay. Please." The words, though not directed at her, pierced Bai Wei's heart. It was the same tone, the same desperation he'd once reserved for Meng Qingli. But this time, the name he whispered wasn't Qingli's. It was hers. Bai Wei felt a strange calmness wash over her, a profound understanding settling in her bones. It turns out that's what it's like to be abandoned, she thought, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. Not the dramatic, theatrical abandonment of movies and novels, but the slow, insidious erosion of a person's presence in your life, until one day, you realize they were never truly there. "I'm afraid it won't appear in front of me from now on," she mused, a bittersweet ache blooming in her chest. The fear, the frantic worry, the desperate pleas, they were for her now. But it was too late. The realization struck her with the clarity of a lightning bolt. In those days, someone you like so much, in the end, it will only be me, a passerby in a long life. She had moved on. She had built a life, a self, independent of his affections, his regrets, his ghosts. He may have finally seen her, truly seen her, but she no longer needed to be seen by him. With a quiet sigh, Bai Wei turned and walked away, the soft patter of rain on the hospital windows echoing the quiet closure in her heart. The credits rolled over the flickering screen set up in the park, the synthesized orchestral swell fading into the gentle murmur of the crowd. Bai Wei felt a pang of melancholy, not for the film's tragic ending, but for the echo it struck within her own life. Just a week ago, she sat in a similar park, a different film, with him. The memory, sharp and bittersweet, pricked at the edges of her healing heart. Beside her, Su Menghe stretched, a soft groan escaping his lips. "Not bad," he commented, his voice a comfortable rumble. "Though I still think that car chase scene was a bit over the top." Bai Wei managed a small smile. Over the top. Perhaps that described her own reactions, her own drama, in the last few weeks. She'd allowed herself to be consumed by the ending of her relationship with Yunshen, a relationship built on shifting sands, a relationship she now realized she had clung to with a desperation that belied its fragility. "Didn't you always say you wanted to go to the park?" Menghe's words pulled her back to the present. He was looking at her, a gentle amusement in his eyes. "It's a nice day today. Let's go shopping after work. You're not as fat as me yet, so you can carry the bags." He punctuated the last sentence with a playful nudge, the familiarity of their years of friendship a soothing balm. A genuine smile finally bloomed on Bai Wei's face. Shopping. It sounded normal. Pleasant. A stark contrast to the tear-soaked nights and the suffocating silence of her apartment. The thought of Yunshen, his brow perpetually furrowed in that familiar expression of conflicted emotion, flickered across her mind, but this time, it didn't bring the familiar stab of pain. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance, a sense of finality. It was over. Truly over. "Sure," she replied, her voice lighter than it had been in weeks. The setting sun cast long shadows across the park's manicured lawns, painting the scene in hues of orange and gold. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant aroma of street food. As she walked alongside Menghe, the comfortable rhythm of their footsteps against the paved path felt strangely grounding. She glanced at him, taking in the familiar slope of his shoulders, the easy smile that always seemed to reach his eyes. He was not Yunshen. He lacked the brooding intensity, the enigmatic charm that had initially drawn her in. But there was a solidity to Menghe, a steadfastness that resonated with a deeper part of her. He was a constant, a familiar presence in her life, a friend who had seen her at her best and her worst, and who had stayed. The realization settled upon her with the quiet certainty of a falling leaf. Perhaps, she mused, this was what she had needed all along. Not the whirlwind romance, the passionate declarations, the almost love. But the quiet comfort of understanding, the unspoken support, the unwavering presence of someone who truly saw her, not as a substitute, a stand-in for a ghost of Yunshen's past, but as Bai Wei. Just Bai Wei. She remembered the last time she saw Yunshen. The strained silence in his apartment, thick with unspoken words and the weight of their shared history. His eyes, usually guarded and distant, had held a flicker of something akin to panic, a vulnerability that she had never seen before. He had reached for her, a hesitant hand outstretched, but she had stepped back. The words she spoke then echoed in her mind, sharp and clear. "You never really saw me, did you?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, a testament to the chasm that had grown between them. He hadn't denied it. He couldn't. He loved the idea of her, the shadow of Qingli he saw reflected in her eyes, in her smile. He didn't love her. The bustling streets of the shopping district were a welcome distraction. The bright lights, the vibrant displays, the cacophony of sounds, it was a sensory overload that pushed the lingering shadows of her past further into the recesses of her mind. Menghe, ever the observant friend, seemed to sense her shift in mood. He steered her towards a brightly lit stall selling steaming dumplings, the aroma filling the air with a comforting warmth. "Spicy pork," he offered, a knowing grin on his face. She nodded, a genuine smile finally replacing the forced cheerfulness she'd been wearing for days. As they ate, their conversation flowed easily, a comfortable mix of teasing banter and shared memories. He told her about a particularly challenging case he was working on, his frustration laced with a dry humor that made her laugh. She, in turn, shared anecdotes from her work, the mundane details of her day taking on a new significance, a symbol of her return to normalcy. There was a lightness to her now, a sense of liberation she hadn't realized she craved. The weight of Yunshin's unresolved past, the burden of being a replacement, had finally lifted. She was free. Free to be herself, free to explore the possibilities of a future unburdened by the ghosts of someone else's love. She looked at Menghe, truly looked at him, and saw not just a friend, but a possibility. A possibility of a different kind of love, a love built on shared laughter, mutual respect, and a genuine connection. It wasn't the fiery passion she had experienced with Yunshin, but it was something deeper, something more real. A slow burn, a gentle warmth that promised a different kind of happiness. A happiness that was hers, and hers alone. The park, the film, the shared meal, they were not just the end of one chapter, but the beginning of another. A new beginning. A beginning she was finally ready to embrace.